Hey, what's up, everybody? If you appreciate the format and you appreciate what we're doing here, then make sure you contribute to the Cash App, make sure you contribute to the PayPal, make sure you donate to the Super Chat. It's only you and your contributions that keep this thing going. Thanks.
Hey, what's up, you guys? This is Dennis Sperling, also known as Uncle D, and I want to continue my series related to the African slave trade. We kind of started off talking about African heroes and great African men, kings, and whatnot, and we ended up segueing into one of the darkest periods that the world has ever seen, and that has to do with the Transatlantic slave trade. And some of those same men that we venerate as heroes, those same kings and emperors, we have to also acknowledge what they did. So what I want you to do, guys, is just kick back and we're going to listen to this. But in the meantime, before we get started, make sure you join the membership. Make sure you become a member. Make sure you join Dennis Sperling Unfiltered. Shout out to Jason Webb. Thank you so much. Shout out to my new member, 8. I guess this is in Russian. I can't really say that. But before we get started, I wanted to make sure I acknowledge that. Here's the thing. We as African Americans tend to romanticize our relationship with our African brothers and sisters. On the continent, we fail to allot to them their fault in our kidnapping and being sold away to work as slaves in the New World, i.e. North America, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. The truth is, as told by their own scholars, the ruling kings on the continent knew exactly what they were doing. This is something that we as African Americans have to face. We have to accept the fact that after 350 years in that time period, at some point, probably very soon after the commencement of the first triangular slave trade, i.e. the Transatlantic slave trade, African rulers knew exactly what they were doing. They knew they were selling us into what became a lifetime of slavery and a lifetime of slavery for our children and our children's children and our children's children's children. This is not what slavery in America, they knew this was not the slavery that they had in Africa. They knew the type of slavery. They had to have heard the stories and how we were being treated and how we were being mistreated, how our children were being enslaved, and how we could never escape slavery and its brutality. Yet they continue to capture other Africans and profit from it. This is something that we as African Americans, West Indians, Afro Latinos, all of us who are in the African diaspora who ended up over here, who were victims of the slave trade, have got to go ahead and accept. Now, I'm laying this out for the points of a greater discussion of reparations. As a trial lawyer, I'm not emotionally tied to who I sue. I just want to make sure I get the proper people who are at fault. And so I'm not going to get the buyer if I'm not going to also get the seller. I'm going to get everybody. And in this particular case, we understand that the white Europeans who benefited from our capture and in purchasing us, we understand that they are culprits. We understand that they benefited. We understand that they paid someone a wage. But it is important for us to realize that we also have to, if the prosecutors say indict their co-conspirator, i.e. those African nations, kings, and tribes who benefited. Now, for those of you who say, oh, well, they were just selling victims of war, they were just selling that been going on in Africa for centuries. Well, that's true, but it's also not true. That's not the whole story. At a certain point, not only did they begin to just kidnap or take people who they had captured in war, POWs, and sell them, but they began to make up wars. They began to instigate wars with their neighbors just so they could have a reason to capture more people and sell them into slavery. On top of that, they didn't even need wars. At some point, they were just roving around the country, capturing people and putting them in slavery. They were literally laying in waiting to capture people. So all of that is going to go out the window. And it's not going to be me saying it. It's going to be these people who I would deem are experts. So without further ado, make sure you get the Snapchat, the Cash App, and the PayPals going. I appreciate that. But in the meantime, I'm going to let this video play, and we're going to watch it. And then I'll interrupt it from time to time when necessary.
"500 years ago, Europeans and Africans met for the first time on these shores. The encounter created the slave trade and changed the world. The slave trade remains a missing chapter in our history, yet Britain led the world in the exploitation of human cargo. This story is not just one of slave raiding by Europeans, but slave trading by Africans. Greed led African kings to sell 12 million people across the ocean. This is not a tale of a trade which grew by accident, but one of a global business created by royal appointment.
The Royal African Company is to be incorporated to set to sea as many ships as shall be thought fitting for the buying, selling, and bartering of gold, silver, Negroes, slaves.
Fair use.
Nor is it simply the story of passive, suffering Negroes freed by heroic white crusaders, but one of black uprising. And above all, this is not a tale of a dead past.
Now, before you guys get caught up into it, understand that they initially said this was a global business, and there were approximately 12 million slaves, or at least I believe that's probably a moderate number. I think it was possibly higher. I mean, who actually keeps a totally accurate count? But 12 million is the number that we'll just use that as a starting point. Okay, but let's continue and review this thing.
It still shapes the way Britons live today.
William Beckford and his father, Alderman Beckford, to put it bluntly, owned my ancestors.
It brings some Britons face to face with a heritage they've never before confronted.
My grandfather was what I'd consider probably a very charming man, and in his young days he was quite a dish. Actually, he really was.
And for the first time, Britons, black and white, discover a common ancestry. It's an ancestry rooted in a past when British ships carried African slaves. Bristol, This sleepy port was once a mercantile powerhouse which dominated the transatlantic slave trade. Ships that wrenched millions of Africans from their homes crowded the Avon for a century. Yet a visitor today sees a city stripped of any reminder of that cargo. Bristol has turned its back on the trade that made it rich.
I was simply amazed. And I think that really in the 20th century, Bristol went through a long period of denial. There really was, as it were, participation in this wider world.
The city's authorities have long resisted efforts, especially by the black communities, to mark its slave trading.
All right. So basically what's going on is you're finding out there are a lot of towns and cities and whatnot in Europe. They want to forget the whole slave trade happened. They just want to say, yeah, we made our money. Our people who made money, they got their money, and then they move on. Bristol was actually a town in England where they manufactured pots and other hardware and whatnot. And so what they were able to do is sell that to the African kings, right, and emperors. They wanted their pots, like cooking pots, right? This is what I'm talking about. We try to say, oh, they needed guns and horses and tobacco and whatnot. No, they traded a lot of us for cooking pots and stuff like that. This is the stuff that they traded us for. And so they were able to do that and swap those things for slaves. And then the ships would go to the New World and get sugar and tobacco and bring that back to England, and they swap that. And that's why they call it a triangular slave trade. But let's continue watching.
Past.
There has been a genuine fear
Let me know if you guys can hear this. Can y'all hear it? If y'all can't hear it, let me know. All right. Can you hear it?
fear than denial.
But in early March this year, the first sign of change appeared. Bristol's dignitaries gathered for the opening of a new footbridge. It was a small step, but a victory for the campaign to commemorate one of the slaves who lived in Bristol, a man called Pero Jones.
We are here with our friends to show our respect to our ancestors who lived and died in this city as enslaved Africans. It's often not known that in 1725, Bristol alone enslaved 16,550 Africans in that 1 year.
It's a bridge that helps us come to terms with, to understand, and sometimes to confront a shared past. A past that contains, for many of us, great sadness.
This moment is a sign that Britain is waking up to its slave trading history. Pero Jones belonged to a Bristol family, the Pinneys. Britain's slave past does not start with Africa. It begins in 17th century England with the British Empire's first slaves, white men. The founder of the Pinney dynasty, Azariah, was farming in Dorset when he was swept up in a rebellion against the king.
The Duke of Monmouth landed in Lyme Regis in June 16.
All right. So they're about to talk about how they enslaved Irish folks and whatnot, but that's not. We're gonna skip this part. Slide ahead a little bit. Okay. Go straight to that.
Grandfather's enslavement probably made John Pinney uneasy about owning slaves, but the scriptures stilled his conscience.
I can assure you I was shocked at the first appearance of human flesh exposed to sale.
But surely God ordained them for the use and benefit of us. Otherwise, his divine will would have been made manifest by some particular sign or token.
He was motivated by commerce, but in doing so, it seems that he regarded his slaves as his principal asset, and he looked after his asset. I flatter myself to say a word respecting the care of my slaves and stock. Your own good sense must tell you they are the sinews of a plantation, and must claim your particular care and attention.
Humanity tempered with justice towards the former must ever be exercised. They surely deserve it, being the very means of our support.
They should be kept clean of ticks.
The demand for the Pinnish sugar was huge. To meet the demand, they needed more slaves, but they had to raise cash to buy those slaves. They turned to the merchants in the city of London for help. The moneymen were prepared to give loans to planters, but it was the higher profits from the slave ships that offered the best returns. The city wanted that business all to itself.
Now, I want you guys to keep in mind, we're still talking about one little town in England. We're not talking about the rest of Great Britain. We're not talking about Scotland, Ireland, France. We're not talking about Portugal, Spain. We're not talking about the Danes. We're talking about one little town, just to give you an idea of what they were doing. But let's continue forward.
The king was always ready to trade favors for cash. He granted a royal charter which gave a single London company, the Royal African Company, exclusive rights over the slave trade. In return, the royal family became its biggest shareholders.
Charles II, by the grace of God, King of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland. To all to whom these presents shall come, greeting.
Okay.
Whereas Guinea, Benin, Angola, and South Barbary, and the Soul.
This is important. I don't want you guys to miss this. What he basically said was that the King of England, in exchange for what we would call stock in the Royal African Company, I'll give you exclusive rights over the slave trade. And so what does that mean? That means that the kidnapping and sale of Africans from the west coast of Africa made that British monarchy rich. Before that, you heard what they were saying. They were borrowing money. They were trying to borrow. You guys still can't hear me? They were borrowing money, trying to get people to give them money. They didn't have any. Remember, these folks had just come out of the Dark Ages. Remember that. They were just coming out of the Dark Ages a couple hundred years out. They didn't have money. They had gone down to Ghana and Mali and robbed them of the gold and stuff they had, but they didn't have any sort of businesses. They didn't have any natural resources. So what? They got into the slave business. So let's continue back with this thing.
And only trade and traffic thereof are the undoubted right of our heirs and successors. And whereas the trade of said regions is of great advantage to subjects of this kingdom. The Royal African Company is to be incorporated in the name of our dearest brother, James Duke of York, His Highness Prince Rupert, Anthony Earl of Shaftesbury, Henry Earl of Ardington, His Grace the Duke of Buckingham, John Earl of Bath. we hereby grant unto the same Royal African Company of England to set to sea as many ships as shall be thought fitting for the buying, selling, and bartering of gold, silver, negroes, slaves, goods, ware, and manufactures.
The company's men would let nothing stand in the way of their drive for profits. They already knew that slavery was widely practiced in West Africa. In most African nations, it was an alternative.
All right. So this is where most people stick on. They say, oh, well, slavery was widely practiced in Africa, but the type of slavery that the Africans were doing on each other, you know, you could end up being the king. You know, you could own a slave, and, you know. So what we like to do as Black Americans, we like to romanticize and say, yeah, for that 350 years that our Black brothers and sisters were being kidnapped, stolen, and taken to the New World, i.e. North America, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, and the Caribbean, those Africans had absolutely no idea at all that it wasn't the type of slavery that that the brothers and sisters were, you know, used to on the continent. Oh no, they didn't know. They didn't know at all. They didn't know they would be kidnapping their brothers and selling these people, and then their children and their children's children would be slaves. They can be slaves. Their whole line of people would be. They didn't know that. Oh my God! So for 350 years, we talking about from 16 something, 15 something, okay, 16 something, all the way up into 1880. They didn't know it all. That's just naive to even think on that. That's just, it would be stupid if somebody still believed, especially the fact you had written accounts, you got people, the same people shipping them over there, taking it back, shipping it over there, do it. How many times they've been doing this 30 or 40 years? Don't you think they had stories? Don't you think those sailors were coming back telling stories? Don't you think the Africans who participated in it eventually found out? You're ignorant and foolish if you think these African kings and lords didn't know. That's just crazy. No, the truth is they were in it for the money. They were in it for the profit. They did it for the bag. So stop romanticizing this. They knew exactly what they were doing. So we'll move forward now.
Alternative to a prison system.
Those who committed crimes, convicts, could be sold into slavery. If you owe the debt.
Now, I want you to pay attention to this sister. This is she is at the University of Ghana. She is a professor there. That's her name. Look her up. Send an email, follow her on Instagram, whatever. This is what these African scholars are saying. So you pay very close attention to what she is saying. All right? Listen to what she is saying about what they knew. This is a studied woman who understands exactly what the kings and whatnot knew. She's going to explain it to you, and you got to listen to it. All right? And y'all make sure y'all get the likes up and the contributions. I'm going to put the link at the bottom. Fair use, by the way. Fair use.
You could be sold into slavery, sometimes through deceit, or you could be tricked into slavery.
Slaves were also acquired as captives of Africa's wars. Europeans had long been part of an established system for bartering them.
The first Europeans who came to Ghana were the Portuguese, and they arrived in 1471. And when they got here, they found that there was a brisk trade in slaves between Ghana and its West African neighbors. And for 100 years, Portugal remained on the coast of Ghana and took part in this coastal trade, going to Senegal, bringing...
For 100 years, Portugal remained on the coast of Ghana. Did it say that they went into the hinterland? Did it say they set up some posts 100 miles in? No, those white men waited on the coast. And those African kings and tribesmen and all those, they would bring the captured Africans to them. That's what they would do. They would not go into the land. White men didn't enter into the mosquitoes and snakes and alligators and all. They didn't run up in that land. It was Africans that went in and captured us and brought us out, and they did it for profit. Okay, and you Black Americans have got to recognize that it is what it is. Now, here's the thing. Crimes have been committed. Nobody's going to suffer for that. But what we're talking about right here is in the context of reparations. In other words, who owes us money? You see what I'm saying? And you should not have a problem for being compensated, even from your brothers and sisters, for unpaid labor that you or your ancestors performed. Loss of land, loss of life, loss of happiness in life. This is what we're looking for in the context of who owes us as African Americans, Caribbean Americans, South Americans, South African Americans. When I mean Black Americans who ended up in South America, Central America, and the Caribbean. Who owes us? And we have to start with the people who actually came into our villages and kingdoms and kidnapped us. You can't sue somebody unless you have all the necessary parties. Your case will get dismissed.
Goods from Senegal, from Nigeria to Ghana, and bringing slaves in exchange for gold. And this was a situation before the transatlantic slave trade was introduced.
The Royal African Company had no interest in the coastal trade. They wanted slaves to ship across the Atlantic. They found a ready supply in local prisoners of war.
When you went to war and you defeated the people, you took captives home. So you decided what to do with the captives. How many slaves do we need for farming? How many do we need for the army? How many do we need for domestic work, etc., etc.? After they've gone through all those logistics, the excess goes through the Atlantic slave trade.
The image we have today.
I have to address this comment. See, this is the problem that we have. Someone says, named Big K says, no one is going to pay Black Americans anything. We have to be real. You know, I've heard many insurance companies and many big corporations tell me that we're not going to pay your client anything. And then you file a lawsuit and then you begin to take their things from them after you get a judgment. That's how that works. What this should say is nobody's going to pay us voluntarily. But once we do the homework, once we do the work, we come to the realization of this is what happened. Then you file suits. You file suits wherever you need, as many lawsuits, wherever you need to do it at, wherever they have property, wherever this country, Ghana, Nigeria, all these places, whatever they have property in the United States, and then you seize it. You're not asking for anything, Big K. You're taking it. This is just like they took us and our ancestors. We're going to take what's owed to us. We're going to take our money back. That's the whole point of reparations, sir. So let's not be a stick in the mud before we even get started. But this is why a lot of Black people, especially people like myself, don't want to get involved in it, because you got folks like Big K right here who say, oh, no, they ain't never going to pay us nothing. They don't have to want to do it. It doesn't matter what you want to do. There's a debt that needs to be paid. We can prove it. And here we go. The main thing is getting everybody on the same page and getting out of this fantasy world that our African brothers had nothing to do with this. They did. And they are part, along with the European kingdoms, the European nations and crowns, and our African crowns and everybody else, companies, they had something to do with it too, and they need to pay. Everybody needs to pay. That's where I'm coming from. Everybody needs to pay. All right, so let's continue.
Of the slave trade as mass kidnapped by Europeans couldn't be further from the truth. For both sides, this was just business.
The African role in the transatlantic slave trade must not be.
I'm gonna run this back because y'all need to hear this. This is a crucial point. I need you guys to hear it from another African scholar. Okay, hear this carefully.
The image we have today of the slave trade as mass kidnapped by Europeans couldn't be further from the truth. For both sides, this was just business.
The African role in the transatlantic slave trade must not be swept under the carpet. The greed factor was there. Kingdoms made money. They rose as a result of the trade. Big, powerful people.
This also, another doctor, okay, another professor, another African scholar in Ghana saying the African role in the slave trade must not be overlooked. Kingdoms rose because, okay, let's put this in context. Mansa Musa makes his trip in 1330. The world realizes that Africa, Ghana, the west coast of Africa has all these riches. European raiders do what they've been doing to each other for hundreds of years. They go down there, they set up shop, they start robbing and jacking. All right, they start, you know, it's only so many of them you can fight. They come in just like the Vikings would come in and raid the British and the French, you know, the English and the French. They came in robbing and jacking. Give us all you go. Give it to the point where, you know, Ghana was now broke. They running out of money. Like, man, so what do we have now? Here we are 100 years later. They've taken all our gold and riches. We just showed the world all we had. And then they came and beat our army and took it all. And so what do we have left to sell? But we don't want to just be powerless. We need to do something. We need to make some money some kind of way. Oh, y'all need Negroes? Oh, we got plenty of Negroes over here. We're going to start selling the Negroes. So they start selling their own people to enrich themselves, to put money back in their coffers. This is what this man is saying they're doing. Now, he didn't go as far as that history, but those of you who've been following my page, I'm putting it in context for you. They ran, it's not like they were overwhelmed. They had money, overwhelming money. They'd always been trading in slaves, but not like this. Not this number. You going to just pick and fight so you can enslave people, so you can sell them to these Europeans who need to tame this wilderness over here they call the New World. So this is what's going on. Y'all make sure y'all get the likes up. I hope y'all enjoy this. I hope this conversation is uncomfortable for you. That's what I want it to be. All right, but let's run that back again, because I need this, y'all to hear this. Everybody in the back, listen, okay? Listen to this. You need to hear this, all right? This is the doctor. Let's listen to the doctor again.
Besides, this was just business.
The African role in the transatlantic slave trade must not be swept under the carpet. The greed factor was there. Kingdoms made money. They rose as a result of the trade. Big, powerful people.
Active collaboration.
The company found that African kings were just as greedy as England's own royal family. They were willing to supply exactly what the plantations needed.
Did you hear that? The African kings and African families were just as greedy as the European families and kingdoms. They were just as greedy. So why is it that we romanticize our African brothers and pretend as though they had nothing to do with it? Oh, they was just victims. They didn't know. They knew hell. They knew what was going on. They did it for the money. They wanted the money. They traded your black butts for the money, brothers. I can trace my first ancestor back to a slave plantation in Virginia called the King Plantation. I was told by my some relatives on my mother's side of the family that, oh yeah, you know, our first ancestor, he called himself, he was brought over here as a king from Africa, and he called himself Washington King because he found out that the first president of the United States was named Washington, and he named himself King. That's not how he got his goddamn name. He came from the King breeding farm in Virginia, and that's why he was one of the king slaves from up there. I found that out on my own a few years back. My own people trying to romanticize this. It was a horrible condition we were sold into by our own people, and we need to stop running away from it, especially if we're calling ourselves going to get reparations. Everybody needs to pay. Uncle D said it, and if you don't like it, I don't care. Everybody needs to pay. The black ones, the white ones, the Europeans, the European nations, the African, all of them, everybody. That's the only way justice will be found. Irrespective of color, we're looking for justice.
The slave owners in the West Indies, they preferred slaves from the Gold Coast because they said these were very hard-working, hardy slaves.
Local businesses sprang up to supply the transatlantic market. The European traders had no need to round up the slaves.
Okay. All right. So Big K is back again. Big K said, thank you, Big K. I appreciate you. Big K, I appreciate you for giving the $5 super chat. Okay. How can you successfully sue African countries for crimes committed before the countries existed? Well, just like any corporation, when you take over a corporation that is in debt or has committed a crime, that new corporation takes up all of their debts and all of their assets. One of the debts that the kingdoms who occupied the space we call Ghana had, or one of the crimes they committed, which left a debt, was the kidnapping of other Africans and selling them off to European corporations. That is a debt. They inherited that debt. They did that crime, that corporation inherits that. Same thing for that government. That government inherits the debts of that, the crimes of that kingdom, they inherit that. And so because of that, what? Those are the people you sue. And I promise you that the good governments in Ghana and Nigeria and all those places, they have property here in the United States. They own assets. They have things just like every other corporation. And those are the things that we would go after primarily, or we could work out some sort of payment plan. I don't know, but that's something that we'll deal with later. Let's get Big K. I appreciate you, but and I appreciate the contributions, but you gotta let. It's almost like you don't want to let it play out. You understand what I'm saying? But let's continue.
The Europeans themselves did not go inland to the villages or to capture slaves. They remained at the forts and the.
Did y'all hear that? The Europeans didn't do what? They didn't go inland. So for that 350 some odd years, the Europeans didn't go inland. What did they do? Let's listen to them again. I want y'all to hear that. Here's another black professor. This is another black professor telling you guys the same thing. They didn't go inland, fellas. The Europeans didn't run up in the bushes and get these Negroes. Oh no, it was other Africans doing, and they knew what they were doing. But let's listen to this other black professor.
He found that African kings were just as greedy as England's own royal family. They were willing to supply exactly what the plantations needed.
The slave owners in the West Indies, they preferred slaves from the Gold Coast. They said these were very hard-working, hardy slaves.
Local businesses sprang up to supply the transatlantic market. The European traders had no need to round up the slaves.
The Europeans themselves did not go inland to the villages or to the town to capture slaves. They remained at the forts and the castles. And it was the African traders who sold the slaves to the Europeans.
You heard that? You said the Europeans didn't even lead the slave. They didn't lead the castles and the forts. They stayed right there and waited for the Africans to bring them to them. So these other Africans would travel hundreds of miles inland and kidnap other Africans and bring them to the shore, march them to the shore. This is what our own brothers did to us. And we just how can we romanticize that? You didn't have a bunch of white men, with battalions of army men running in there and capturing black folks. They didn't do that. This was Africans doing it to other Africans. We can't romanticize that anymore. Either we're going to deal with it like grown men and women, or we're going to forget about it. But you can't sue one and not sue the other one. We got to sue them all. Let's tell the whole story. Tell it all. Tell the truth. Shame the devil. That's what we're doing today. Amen.
Now, what happened was that there were middlemen who would meet the inland traders bringing the slaves. They would buy these slaves and then in turn resold them to the European merchants in the castles.
Rival European powers were building castles to protect their cargoes. Within a century, there would be a fort every 3 miles on what used to be called the Gold Coast. It came to be known as...
Did you hear that? There would be a fort. There would be a fort every 3 miles. Do you know how many miles that is? A fort every 3 miles set up to barter and trade and purchase slaves and ship them over to the New World. Every 3 miles. And you telling me these Africans, our African brothers, because they're still our brothers, you saying that they didn't know what they were doing? You telling me that was did they have a fort every 3 miles in Africa for trading slaves? No, they didn't. They did not. They knew it was different. And so why is it that you're allowing that? And here's the thing, you know, I know, see, we fantasize as African Americans, we fantasize about going home, we fantasize about our African brothers, but that still doesn't mean they didn't do us wrong. They did a wrong to us. This was wrong. This was wrong on so many levels, and they did it for money. They did it because they wanted money. They did it for pots and gunpowder and whatever newfangled stuff Europeans were bringing down. They did it for those things. And we allowed them to do it, period. But let's continue.
The Slave Coast.
Yeah. They did it so often, they renamed it the Slave Coast. Okay, so they knew what they were doing.
The Royal African Company appealed to its major shareholder, James II. He began a string of garrisons, motivated possibly by the national interest, but more likely by his own profits. Every time a British ship was sighted, its sailors could rely on a welcome from the fort and from the African settlement next to it.
We took up our old anchorage opposite Cape Coast Castle and made arrangements for commencing our old business of gathering a cargo. Our first object is to lay in stocks of rice for the slaves on the passage to the West Indies. You will naturally think it must be difficult to transact business with these people from ignorance of their language. But they have been for so many years trading with the English that all the traders have broken English enough for the purpose.
The Europeans, the English had come there so often that the Africans learned to speak English from them coming down there. They've been working with them so much, capturing other black Africans and shipping them off. That's how often they were down there.
The transatlantic slave trade dominated West Africa. For some kingdoms, selling slaves became an economic necessity. And all along the
what that means is it's an economic necessity. What that means is that kingdom was dependent on its welfare, on the trading and the capturing or the stealing, the kidnapping and stealing and selling other Africans. That's how dependent this kingdom was on these crimes against humanity that were committed against those of us who landed in the New World after being captured and caught and sold. The whole kingdom depended on them selling us. That's what these people are saying to you. That's what these African scholars are saying to you in this video right here. Fair use.
Coast, new trading settlements were springing up.
In the 17th century, the Atlantic slave trade became the most important activity on the coast. We find that almost every town, coastal town, and almost every European fort and castle was involved in slave trading. So we have about 65 slave markets in Ghana alone.
Look, I mean, okay, this is an African scholar telling you, brothers and sisters, there were 65 slave forts in Africa alone, on the coast, 65 alone. The most important thing coming off the west coast of Africa for 300 some years, over 300 years, was slavery. And you telling me our brothers and sisters didn't know what they were doing? Are you telling me this? Now you sound foolish. But more importantly, here's what I want you to understand. And I'm gonna say some things that's gonna hurt some people. Those of you who are Black Power, you're into Black history. Why is it that you never tell us this and put it in context? See, I'm looking at it not as a historian. I'm looking at this as a litigator. And I'm seeing these people who participated in these parties, these corporations, these royalties, these royal families. These are necessary parties to this any litigation moving forward having to do with reparations. You can't sue you can't sue London. You can't sue the royal crown in London and not sue the royal crown in Ghana. You can't sue England and not sue Ghana, Nigeria, and Togo, Benin without suing they're all in it together. So why is it that you haven't laid that out? Why is it that you lie to our people so much? You so-called pro-black and black historian. Why is it that you don't tell our people the truth? That our own brothers and sisters sold us into slavery and they owe us a debt, along with the white man and everybody else involved in it. Why is that? And this is why so many young black people are just so discontent with this whole pro-black movement and the black historian. This is because they know you're lying and you're telling them half-truths, and telling a half-truth is just like telling a lie. Okay, so again, I'm looking at it from a point of a litigator and what is important to making sure that everybody involved played a part, and then we'll sort out what their part was, but we at least got to get to the point where we say, you know, you dismissing that. Oh no, they didn't know what they were doing. Oh no, they were just selling criminals of war. They were just selling people who owed. No, they were selling anybody they could get hold of after a while. Didn't you just hear that woman, the doctor, say that this was their primary source of income? The kingdom would fall unless they begin. They don't even have enough prisoners of war to sell. They were kidnapping folks who had nothing to do with any war, didn't have any problem with anybody, period. They were selling anybody they could get. That's where we at. And I'm very disappointed at these black scholars for not saying this. And this is why a whole generation of black folks don't even want to hear about black history, period. Because they know you're full of lies and you're doing it for your own benefit. You're trying to follow the status quo in your college. You don't want to offend anybody because you want to keep your damn job. You want to keep writing grants. You want to keep it moving in the same direction so you can get paid, so you can get that tenure. You faking it. And the brothers and sisters are tired of it. Period. That's why the reparations movement hadn't gone anywhere in 100 years, because of folks like you in charge of it.
The Africans could hardly have anticipated the consequences of all this, but the bargain they struck with the European slave traders transformed the continent. What started as a local tradition turned into a monster that eventually swallowed 12 million people.
Slavery existed in societies that had no prison systems. It was part of the punitive measures against criminal conduct, criminal behavior. Slaves lost their liberty. They went away, maybe into the neighboring state or the neighboring nation, but only for a season. It was not a long-term loss of liberty. And the children of the slaves, of course, were never slaves in that context. But here, of course, with the transatlantic slave trade, you have a final separation. People went away and they never came back.
Slavery would spirit millions away from the continent. It would be the cause of war and torment, and it would drag both Africa and Europe into a harsh new era.
In the indigenous system, especially in Ghana, no slave owner had the power of life and death over the slave. But in the castle, you could do anything to the slave. You could kill the slave, you could maim the slave, you could mutilate the slave, you could punish the slave as you liked.
All right, so what you just heard her say was that in Ghana, where this slave castle is, no slave owner had the right to kill or take a slave's life. But here's the thing, at this castle, which is also in Ghana, they could see, oh, damn, them slaves that we just dropped off over there, they getting killed, beat up, raped, all kind of stuff is happening to them. Damn, they going into a different kind of slavery. Even from that point right there, they understood that this was a different kind of slavery than the slavery that they had been used to for hundreds, maybe thousands of years on the continent. You could see right there, when we drop these people off, we don't even treat them this bad. So damn, what's going to happen when they put them on those boats and send them over there across that water like that? They knew then that it was a different kind of slavery. You on this side of the door, you get, you know, you like damn near a family member. But as soon as you go into this castle, you getting treated like worse than stray animals on the street. They can kill you. You see, this is, you cannot tell me that our Africans are some of the smartest people on this planet. They built all these great institutions, sophisticated science, math, astronomy, traversed the world. And you telling me they couldn't figure out after 350 years that the slavery that they had in Ghana and the other parts of West Africa and Central Africa was different than the slavery that they sold our African ancestors into who landed here in the United States? You're a damn fool if you believe that. At this point, you're just faking ignorance. Stop romanticizing these crimes. Stop. All of them have to pay, period. If we're talking about reparations, everybody who's responsible has to be held responsible.
Cape Coast Castle in modern Ghana, the headquarters of the Royal African Company, a place of misery and terror.
So here we go. Hold on a minute.
They lived in the dungeons as though they were animals, you know, so they weren't given enough food.
All right, here we go. So we got another one. Freeman Network says this. He says African tribal slavery and European chattel slavery are not the same thing. Yeah, we get that. That's not the question, Mr. Freeman, the Freeman Network. The question is, what did the Africans know in 350 years? The question is, did they know that they were selling us into this sort of horrible system that would even hold our children and our children's children in bondage? That's the question after 350 years with Africans going and coming and people being kidnapped and then released after 10, 12, 15 years, and then they themselves coming back and becoming slavers. This is what I'm trying to ask you. Yeah, I know. See, we like to romanticize our African brothers' involvement in this atrocity. We like, oh no, they didn't know what they were doing. We want to allow them to plead the benefit of ignorance. Oh no, they didn't know what they were doing. And I'm telling you, yes, they did know what they were doing. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it. And they did it anyway because they wanted the money. They did it for the money. That's what I'm trying to tell you, brothers and sisters. And until you guys begin to accept that, you will not get the justice that you deserve, because you won't have everybody involved in the horrendous crimes that were perpetrated upon you and our ancestors. That's what I'm saying. You need to begin to go ahead and grow up and accept it for what it is, period. Stop living in this fantasy world. Stop doing that to yourselves. You're lying to yourselves. It's time to stop now. We need to become a more mature people. This is the 11th hour, period, brothers. Now cut it out. Let's continue watching.
They were prisoners. We have the condemned cell where turbulent slaves were kept. And a lot of them were turbulent because, I mean, if you live in your country and somebody comes out here and takes you into captivity, you wouldn't take kindly to that.
Slaves were packed into every space. They could be trapped here for months. There were only two ways out: to the sea and the slave ships, or to the graveyard.
They had to go to the bathroom in the dungeons. They were fed in the dungeons. Their whole life was in the dungeons. And that was very uncomfortable, very unhealthy. There could be some epidemics, no windows. They really were confined to those little rooms.
The forts became a byword for cruelty and rape. The Europeans' moral restraint evaporated under the African sun.
Most of the colonial officials who came onto the coast came without their wives. So most of them became mistresses. They doubled up as domestic servants, as mistresses, concubines for these officials.
So basically what that's telling you is some of the lovely ladies said not only were they were concubines, mistresses, these white men came down there with no wives. They had no wives with them. So what were they doing? They was messing around with the African women, period. That was what was going on. And you can't tell me that those lovely ladies, many of them didn't volunteer for the job. I just refuse to believe that also. I believe that they played a part and they knew exactly what they were doing, period. So let's continue watching. Now it's going to get even more uncomfortable for you all, because I'm basically going to tell you that a lot of our sisters, our lovely African queens, godmothers, mother goddesses, they played a part in this. They helped facilitate it. They cooked for them. They kept them safe. They adopted these white European slave owners into the family, kept them clean. Remember, they didn't have anywhere to stay. Where do you think they were going to stay? Huh? They wasn't traipsing off into the hinterland. They wasn't going inland. They were sitting at the castle with their concubine, their African concubine princess and queens with them. Let's keep listening. This is going to get painful for y'all.
For some of the female slaves who lived in the dungeons, the governor saw, in inverted commas, some of the female slaves. And when they were found pregnant, if they were lucky, they were set free.
The Europeans had no shame about declaring their conquests. In Cape Coast, families still carry names like Gonzalez, Coleman, Frith, and De Silva.
You had the European merchants intermarrying or having local African women, and their offspring, called the mulattoes, also growing in number. As the slaves were brought in, not everybody was sold and shipped up. Some remained. And so one would see a kind of a cosmopolitan life growing along the coast.
The West Africans tolerated.
I don't think that registered to you all, what that man just said. A kind of cosmopolitan life was growing on along the coast. That means we out here making money. I got this European man, I got this baby. He done let me go free because I got his kids for him. Translate the fact, let's fast forward to 2021. My man, I got a baby, he buying me Birkin bags. Yeah, you know, he's shipping the Africans over, but you know, I'm good. The whole west coast of Africa, right? Cosmopolitan lifestyle. Slavery has brought in, the capture of other Africans has brought all kind of wealth and money and riches to the west coast of Africa, which was otherwise at that time poor and broken. So it was because of our capture and enslavement that other Africans became rich. People personally benefited from it. It was greed, family. They didn't give a hot damn what happened to you after you got on that ship, as long as they got paid. That's what I'm trying to tell you all, family. This is what I'm saying. And so when it comes to the question of who owes us reparations, all of them do. Those European countries, those African countries, those African families, those European families, they all owe us money. And I'm going to give you something else. Very soon, we're going to talk about the Black Americans who also had slaves in the United States. We're going to talk about them too, because they are part and parcel, not only the American families, the white families, but the Black American families that held slaves in the dozens, in the hundreds. Everybody has to pay. This is where we at. If we're going to file suit, if we're going to be serious about it, we can't hold back. Everybody's got to pay. We need our money.
To the traders' brutality because European military backing gave them power. and they needed to import cheap brass and iron tools for farming and cooking. The Africans were always hunting for a better deal. It was the small English town of Bristol which offered that deal.
Okay, now we're back. We're back to the Africans were always looking for a better deal. They needed their farming tools and their pots and their pans. And so what happened? Little town of Bristol, right? Little town of Bristol is up here in England. They got these manufacturers. We can do this. We can make these little widgets and gadgets, and we can sell them to these Africans, and these Africans can give us money and blah, blah, blah. And they'll go over there to Europe with those Africans, go to the Caribbean with those Africans, sell them, get sugar cane, tobacco, bring it back to England, and we'll all get rich. That's basically what's happening. This is the triangle. Get the likes up. I hope you're uncomfortable. If you're uncomfortable, you need to hit the like button because more people need to feel like this. We all need to get on the same page. Y'all serious about reparations? Well, I'm here now. Let's talk about it. Let's get the conversation going, but let's have an honest conversation. See, I'm one of those lawyers that's going to tell you, you know what? Either you can take this deal and get 15 years, or you can risk the chance of going to jail and be there for 100 years. Choice is yours. 5 o'clock, I'm going home. But you're going to pay me anyway. Questions are, yeah, I know you don't like that, but I'm the perfect person to deliver this conversation to you because I don't care about your feelings. I'm telling you as a trial lawyer, especially a civil litigation attorney, if you're representing a plaintiff, you need to figure out each and every person who might be responsible for the harm caused to your client. And if I'm looking at this as a lawyer determining, well, who owes us African Americans, American descendants of slaves, foundational Black Americans, who owes us reparations? Who's responsible? Well, I can't sue the buyer without suing the seller, right? I can't sue the purchaser without the enslaver without suing the kidnapper, right? That makes no sense. You're missing somebody. You got to figure out who's more responsible. Maybe 20% his fault, 80% his fault. I don't know, but everybody got to pay is the thing. This is where we at. And the reason this is so upsetting to me is because, like many of you, I've heard hints of this. And throughout, I'm a 46-year-old man, and no African scholar has ever really broke it down to me like this. And I'm a lawyer, and I'm looking at it. This is what's upsetting to me. Because our African scholars have not been honest with us. Our so-called Black power Africa, they have not been honest with us. They have not broken, they have not told us the truth as Black men and women. And it's unfortunate, but that's why we have to lead ourselves and don't worry about no damn leaders. But let's go ahead and continue.
Local mineral deposits gave the city a unique advantage. Bristol could make high-grade metal goods cheaply. Factories spread across the Avon Valley to meet the new African demand.
This is what's known as a guinea pan that was used as one of the trade items that filled the Bristol merchant ships that sailed to West Africa. And for several of these, one could exchange a slave in the early part of the 18th century. And it was because these small factories on the Avon Valley were able to develop an industrial structure to manufacture these large quantities cheaply that basically Bristol was able to develop a slave trade in the early 18th century.
Bristol's golden age was dawning. The families who transformed the city used their wealth to buy huge estates. Abraham Elton's descendants still live in his stately home, Clevedon Court.
Well, he was very much a self-made man. He came from a rather humble background. He was apprenticed to a mariner and became a master mariner, but clearly had a strong entrepreneurial flair and finally became a merchant.
Abraham spotted the opportunities in metals. He bought land bearing extensive deposits of copper and began to search for new markets.
He was looking for an outlet for his copper products. He had the raw materials for the business, he had the copper works, he had an outlet with the Bristol brass industry for the copper, but naturally he was looking for wider markets.
Abraham's seafaring connections told him that Africans would pay good money for high-grade brass. He seized the opportunity. A wide number of people were involved in stocking the slave ships. So something that seems completely unconnected to the slave trade, such as the brass industry.
So this white man said, I got a buyer down here that wants to buy my brass products. I don't care where they get their money from. I don't care if they get money from Satan himself. Okay? As long as they can pay the price, I'm gonna get involved. This is what this white man in Bristol said. Now, we can hold them responsible. That's easy. But it's difficult for us as Black people, as descendants of Africans, to hold our own brothers and sisters responsible for the part that they play. Now, you know, we got to deal with that. But let's go ahead and get back to this. This is an important. This is the business need. This is the driving forces. This is all this we need to understand.
Was actually very much geared to an export market to the West African coast, because West African warlords wanted brass pots. And so most of the brass pots were directed for what they called the Guinea trade. Abraham was an aggressive cost cutter.
Yes, he said brass pots. He said brass pots. These African kings and warlords traded us for brass pots, like pots to cook in. Pots. That's what we were worth. And y'all don't want y'all money back. I want my money. Let's keep listening.
He and others spotted that with a simple redesign, the ships that took their metal goods to Africa could also carry slaves to the Caribbean. They could then bring back sugar to England. At a stroke, their costs were slashed and their profits doubled. Their insight gave birth to the triangular trade.
All right, so basically what he's saying, what this narrator is saying, the people in Bristol figured out how they could ship the ships. Change the ships, small alterations. They can take their products, their manufactured goods, to the African West Coast. And then from the African West Coast, they can use those same ships, reload, take those ships, fill them up with African slaves or Africans who have been captured, because that's what they were. They weren't slaves, they were captured Africans, human beings, and ship them over to the Caribbean. And then from the Caribbean, come straight back to England, right? And fill up again, go back down to the West Coast of Africa, back to the Caribbean, back up to England, back down to, so it was called a triangular trade. This made things so much easier, because now what? It's like they use one ship for like a big U-turn, a big round trip. Instead of going here and coming right back there, then going here and coming right back there, then going over here and coming back there, they just use the same ships and went in a triangular trade and made and mechanized this thing, man. That's what they did.
What you tried to do was to fill your ships on the outward journey to Africa. You would then be paid for the slaves you took on the next leg of the journey, and then the third leg bringing the sugar and the tobacco back and the rum back to Bristol, which you then sold on. So
just to be clear, the ships in Bristol would take the copper products and all those manufactured goods to the Africans. They would pick up some money there, okay? The Africans would then fill up the ship with captured Africans. They would then take those Africans to the West Indies. They would sell them, pick up some money there. And then they would come back to Bristol and sell the sugar and the rum and all those other things that they picked up from the West Indies and sell that in Bristol. So they was making money at every angle of that triangle. They were making money everywhere. So they were maximizing the time spent and their resources. So it was a win-win-win all the way around for them. That's what they mean by triangular trade. It was profitable. It's just so profitable to keep doing it. And everybody involved was making money. And it didn't matter if Africans were being torn away from their families and kidnapped. And, it was no longer just tribes being, warring against other tribes. They was taking anybody. What did a 10, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old boy have to do with a war between some tribes? They was killing everybody. Everybody wasn't at war, but everybody was a potential profit to be had. That's what's going on now. Free for all.
That you minimized as far as you could your financial risks.
The Bristol merchants had succeeded in surpassing the Royal African Company. They gave the African customers what they wanted at half the price.
It was not an exchange of unequals. It was an exchange of equals. One must remember that many of these African societies were very complex. They're very urban in places. Some of the cities were very large, and therefore they were not going to have shoddy European goods. So it required great skill in getting the right sorts of commodities. And the Bristol merchants in particular were
Did you hear what this man said? This man said that they weren't just trading with some people who just fell out the trees. They were sophisticated. They had cities, I mean, not like a city like New York City, but it was cosmopolitan, it was urban. They had bars and pubs, and you couldn't just give them anything. They wanted high quality products. This is what they demanded. So you're not talking about ignorant people. That's not what we're talking about here, brothers and sisters. You can't even say that they were being taken advantage of. They knew what the difference between a high grade pot and the other stuff, than stuff that was low quality. They knew exactly what was going on. Stop fantasizing and believing your African brothers and sisters didn't know exactly what was going on. That's the whole point of this conversation I'm having with you. This is one video, and there are dozens and dozens of them on YouTube. You don't even have to read anymore. Back in the day, you had to read. We didn't have YouTube. You had to read. You don't even have to read anymore. You got the scholars bringing it right. You got some PhD level conversation going right on YouTube. And it's right there for you. But if you guys want to talk about Quavo and Cardi B, we can do that. We can cut this show right now and talk about that, because I know that's what you're looking at on YouTube. But again, it's all right here, brothers. You cannot allow our African brothers to plead ignorance. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew what was happening to us. They were willing participants, as this professor here is saying. They were equals. There was no disadvantage involved. They were equals. And the Africans were looking for the best price for what they can get. So they would negotiate. Man.
very skilled at bringing together these different items which were acceptable for trade.
The breakthrough in Bristol sent slave trade profits soaring. The city's restless merchants would use those profits to begin an historic shift in British life, the Industrial Revolution.
Okay. What this is saying, that's important. What that just said is that this industrialization of this town, Bristol, brought about the industrialization of Europe. It changed the lifestyle of everybody and how they were living there. The money that was coming in, the riches, the wealth, it changed everything, family. This is what the sale and enslavement of our black brothers and sisters who were sent to the Americas, whether it's North America, Caribbean, South America, Central America, the vast majority of which were sent, the vast majority of Africans having been sent to the Caribbean and South America, not North America. But the bottom line is their capture and their theft, their kidnapping changed the whole world. It just industrialized Europe, which means it modernized it. It got them rich. The houses got bigger. The cars got fly, they didn't have cars. That's what I'm saying. All right, on our backs, with our blood and sweat.
Among Abraham Elton's circle of friends was Thomas Goldney, who had made a fortune from a single successful voyage. He ploughed some of the money into the work of an old family friend, Abraham Darby. Darby was experimenting with new ways of making high-grade iron goods. He moved his works to Shropshire, where he started to smelt iron with coke, a revolutionary process. The iron produced in Coalbrookdale was tough enough to make tools that would not bend or break. It opened the way to the modern age.
These experiments took place in 1709, and they're generally considered to be the point, the defining moment at which the Industrial Revolution begins. What developed was a remarkable partnership between the people who had the know-how on the one hand and the people who had the money on the other. What the Shropshire Ironmasters were trying to do was to find a source of coke-fired bar iron that was acceptable to the African market. And it was this, to some extent, that inspired the industrial developments that took place.
Okay. What they're telling you is these Africans were picky. They had to develop an iron that the Africans would accept. We're not just going to accept anything like mine. You can't come down here with your fake steel and iron. We want the best that you have to offer. That's basically what they're saying. So the Africans say, no, we're not taking that. You're going to send that back. You're going to get us some high quality steel. We're not paying the price you're asking for it. And so they had to begin to do, the technology had to catch up with the critiques of the purchasers. So we're talking about people who were trading as equal. These weren't some stupid people on the West Coast. These people had built civilizations. These people had built the Mali empire, the Songhai Empire. They knew exactly what they were doing. These were sophisticated people. They weren't fooling our brothers and sisters. They knew exactly what was going on. So, this is what this conversation is about.
The Goldney Derby Partnership also inspired Ironbridge, the cradle of the Industrial Revolution. This great leap forward is usually attributed to the native genius of British engineers, but it owed much to the demands of the African trade.
The Africans made them step their game up.
By 1700, ships were pouring down the Severn Valley to Bristol, carrying goods destined for buyers on the West African coast.
To get a voyage to work, the merchants had to gather in commodities from the Bristol region. Many of these came from the Severn Valley, and it was the ability to get those commodities together that actually allowed the ships to trade with Africa and for the whole economies to work. So in some ways, the Industrial Revolution allowed the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, to be economically viable, to actually happen. Because without the Industrial Revolution, the commodities would have been too expensive and the African communities would not have been willing to trade.
In Africa, Bristol's iron was so valuable, it became a kind of currency.
Mm-hmm. Trade is all done on the principle of exchanging one piece of goods for another. All kinds of goods are priced by the number of bars of iron they're worth. Say 4 muskets equal to 40 bars, tobacco, beads and cloth, 20 bars. The total is more or less according to the value of the slave, so that supposing the bar is worth 1 shilling and 6pence, these goods would purchase a slave worth about £9 sterling, which at present is about the price of a prime slave.
The sugar trade with Bristol had made Nevis rich, but it was a tedious backwater. John Penny, now a successful sugar planter, longed to come home to Bristol.
The magic of the gold rush was over. A lot of people were coming back to this country and trying to bring money they'd made in Nevis or in other West Indies back to this country. And he was one of those too.
They had made so much money, they were tired of making money. Imagine that. They left, they were broke. They went over there and made so much money that they were tired of making money and they were ready to go back home to London, back home to England, rich. Imagine how much money you have to make to be tired, to grow up broke and then be tired of making money. Imagine that. This is where we at now.
Penny had built a great house, Mount Travis, on the island of Nevis, and acquired 13 sugar estates. His grandfather had been a convict. He was returning to Bristol the equivalent of a millionaire. But he didn't leave.
His granddaddy was a convict. That basically, he came from nothing. His granddaddy was a nobody. He went over there and made so much money, he was coming back as a millionaire. Remind you, this is at the time where they had kings and queens and lords and stuff. And he was basically a peasant, a nobody, and he came back a millionaire. You know what I'm saying? He had more money than the royalty, so to speak. This is where we at.
it all behind. As he sailed away from Nevis, he brought with him the ultimate status symbol of the prosperous West Indian planter.
Listen to this.
A slave he had named Pero Jones. Pero was separated from the last of his African family, his sisters Nancy and Shaba, when he set off for England, never to return.
Here's another thing you got to have. Not only having black slaves was also considered a status symbol. Even going back to ancient times, having a black slave in Greek and Rome was considered having a status symbol because remember, the blacks were where they got, it would be like me having a white driver drive me around town as a black man in America. Like, damn, you got a white boy driving him around? Okay. You know, it's a status symbol because they're supposed to have a higher social status than you. The Romans looked to the Africans or the Cushites or whatever you want to call the black people, the darker races in Africa. That's where they got their learning from. That's where they got the science and astrology and the gods and all that stuff from. And so to have one of those people as your driver or your slave was a status symbol. So when this man said he brought an African back to England as his slave, that's also a status symbol. Okay, keep that in mind.
Pinny and Pero moved into a brand new house in Bristol.
He built the house that we're now sitting in. He acquired land in Somerset. He still had land and houses in Dorset. He continued in the sugar business, trading with the plantations in the West Indies at a time when sugar was becoming increasingly part of the diet.
England probably seemed strange to Pero the African, but the sight of a black man was far from unusual in Bristol.
Now, see, here's the other thing I want you guys to understand. This man here, he wasn't just the only white man doing it. It was so many other ones. They, you know, you hear these English people talk this oxen, blah, 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 blah. They sound so sophisticated. They made that money. They were trading with Africans on the West Coast. They made that. That was blood money that they were making. They got that wealth through blood money, through the sacrifice and pillage and the purchase of Africans who were then shipped off to the New World and worked to death. Our ancestors. This is where this comes from. So don't be impressed by Europe, because see, before that, they had nothing. Until they began to go to Africa and straight up rob Africa, strong arm, taking, robbing, jacking, threatening, taking the gold, taking the wealth, and then broke Africa down to the point that Africa then began to sell its own people to begin to regain wealth and accrue, the kingdoms did. This is where they got all that from. So you should not be so terribly impressed by Great Britain or Europe, all that, because they built their wealth not just on Africa's natural resources and minerals, but also on Africa's people. See, this is what you got to remember. Don't be so impressed by that. Now, I say all this with no animosity. I'm not emotional with this conversation. I'm talking to you as a litigator. We have to establish who is at fault. Clearly, we've always held the Europeans at fault. They've gotten rich. But see, some of us are afraid to look and look southward at our African brothers and sisters because we romanticize that. You got to stop doing that. But let's go ahead and continue. We're almost finished with this video, and then we'll open it up.
Many merchants kept slaves as valets and housekeepers.
He may have started as a slave, but he is described as a servant or valet. And he looked after John Penny personally. One imagine bringing his shaving water, setting out his clothes, and so on. He was working for John Penny for 32 years.
On John Penny's return to Bristol, he found a city more interested in spending money than in making it. Complacency would cost Bristol dear. In 1794, the Bristol poet Romain Thorne wrote an epic poem in praise of the city. It somehow neglected to mention the slave trade.
Now look at that.
Majestic Bristol, to thy happy port, prolific commerce makes its loved resort.
Even the white people knew they was wrong. Why wouldn't they? You made all this money doing a slave trade, right? You neglect to mention, you know, that this is how your money came about. That's like a drug dealer who spent his entire career earning his millions of dollars selling crack cocaine and marijuana and heroin And then once he launders his money, he cleans it up. He just have everybody thinking he owned the McDonald's or Kentucky Fried Chicken or a damn cell phone shop. That's how he made his riches. They don't want to mention that, you see, because they knew it was wrong. They knew, as much as they try to justify it by calling Ham's Law or saying we were doing these African a favor by stealing them from their home country and separating them from their children and wives and husbands and villages and language and religion and spirituality. They knew, even though they tried to they still knew they were wrong. They knew they were wrong. And that's why they wanted to try to forget about it. They wanted to shoo that and hush that evil up under the rug, and hopefully nobody will dig it up. But oh no, we're going to dig it up because we're going to talk about it in the context of who owes us as African Americans, all of those people who were kidnapped and brought from Africa to the New World. If we're going to have a conversation, the civil, in the context of civil litigation related to reparations, we must hold everybody accountable. There's no more of that shoo-shooing. You can't hide it. Let's talk about it. But they knew it was wrong. That's my point.
Gallant ships with spacious sails unfurled, waft to thy shore the treasures of the world.
The docklands were the heartland of Bristol, and you had lovely residential houses being built just across the street from the warehouses by merchants who were all growing very grand by the 1720s and 30s from what was a pretty money-grubbing and hands-dirtying trade. And then if you walk across to Queen Square, there were at least 8 African merchants in this square that was developed in the 1720s. It was one of the first provincial examples of what people have called the urban renaissance, the beautiful Georgian explosion of houses and facilities in the urban center. And it was very much financed and driven by people directly involved in the slave trade. And the whole square was really peopled by those, not only in the Africa trade, but in the West India, Carolina, and Virginia trades. They were all in it. And these were the same people who, while they're shipping slaves from Angola to St. Kitts in decks no higher than 4 foot 2 inches, they're also investing in the Theatre Royal. They're becoming patrons in banks. They're investing in the new private libraries. So
basically, while they're dealing in blood, right? They're kidnapping people and they stacking people 3, 4, 5 levels high and sending them bodies and bodies. They know you stacking these people in here 20, 30, 40%, sometimes more, these people are going to die, right? Mind you, you got a wife and 4 or 5 mulatto children down in Africa, right? So these are human beings. These are the same people you've been dealing with for years, hundreds of years. The European, you say, oh, they're dying on ships that you're financing and putting over there, and you making money. All these horrors you're doing, and you got the nerve to invest in art, in plays, in the opera. You sitting there all sophisticated, as though I'm better than now. You sitting there all sophisticated and you killing people with your actions for money. And that's what the Europeans are doing. We don't have a problem blaming the Europeans for that, but the Africans were doing the same thing. Our African brothers were doing the same thing. They knew what they were doing. And you can't tell me they don't. You can't tell me they didn't.
You have this strange mixture of brutality and gentility.
Brutality and gentility.
That is just very much part and parcel of this triangular trait.
In Bristol, wealth bought respectability. The men who had made their fortunes from the slave business craved social recognition.
They bought respectability. In other words, everybody knew they were barbarians. Everybody knew they were savages. Look at the savage stuff that you do. You separating mothers and children and fathers and families, and now you coming in here trying to be a patron of the arts and buy your way back into genteel society. And they were allowed to do it for the right price. That's so cold about it. That's what the Europeans did. And the crazy thing is, like I said, our brothers and sisters went along with them hand in hand. So we can't let them off. Anything we say the Europeans did, our own brothers did the same damn thing to us. It's a cold game.
Trader or a merchant in the 18th century was still to have low status. You were still shown the back entrance, as it were. So that when you came into vast sums of money, which is what the slave merchants and the traders in slave-produced commodities acquired, you had to buy yourself into society. Now, the way to do that was simple. You had to build a mansion, a pile, hopefully in the neoclassical, Neo-Palladian style, to show that you had learning or that you understood the classics. And then you had to patronize art.
Thomas Goldney was now one of Bristol's commercial aristocrats. He created an estate in the newly fashionable district of Clifton.
This is what they did with the money.
The elegant veneer concealed the hard-nosed businessman.
In this garden is where essentially all Goldney's interests can be linked symbolically. Out here we have the harbour, where he could see the ships coming in, the slave ships going out, his commodities, his industrial goods coming down from Shropshire. He then laid out some wonderful gardens, including over here a tower, which is in fact an engine house, which contained a steam engine, the type that was used to pump mines, which his investments up in Shropshire, the Coverdale Company, were producing. But he used it not to pump mines, but to pump his own water gardens, to recycle water backwards and forwards.
The splendour of the Goldney estate had one main purpose: to impress Bristol's social elite.
So this is you know what basically what this dude is saying is, now that I've gotten all this blood money and I've done these horrific things, I got to clean up my reputation and let me get these gardens and this self-pumping pump and water my gardens, and I'm gonna have flowers out here and whatnot. This is what they did. This is, to me, is like when dope dealers say stuff like, well, I just did this to feed my family. I just did this atrocity to feed my family. And they sitting around there, the women walking around with expensive purses, and the children got all these nice things and whatnot. He didn't do this to feed us. He wanted to be rich. It was greed. You could have said, okay, I sold 10 slaves. I got enough money. My family is good. I can put my boy through college. I'll be a blacksmith. No, he wanted to be filthy rich, super rich. That's what he did. He did it at all costs, period. But so we understand the European aspect of this. Let's move forward. And let's move on to what our brothers and sisters was doing, okay? Back in the motherland, because that's what this conversation is supposed to be about.
He was very ill and now at Ashton for a change of air. I much doubt his recovery. One or other of us visit him 3 or 4 times a week.
Now this is
he has waited upon my person upwards of 32 years.
This is the African that he had brought back, the one that was in his servitude for 32 years. The brother ended up drinking himself to death and just got drunk every day because he missed home. You got him up in cold ass England, and he's up there for 32 years. Oh, he's not a slave, he's a servant. Well, why couldn't he go home then? He still wouldn't let him go. Even on his dying day, wouldn't let him go. You see what I'm saying? So he died up there of drunkenness and probably homesickness. But he wasn't a slave though, right? But he couldn't leave. Let's keep
listening. I cannot help feeling much for him. Notwithstanding, he has not lately conducted himself as well as I could have wished. Penny sent him to Long Ashton, just outside Bristol, where he convalesced but then sadly died. And there is rather a charming, almost an obituary of saying how much he had come to know and to like him. Then there's a sting in the tail, even though at the end of his days he died of drunkenness. But still, he starts off by speaking well of this servant.
Perrault did not psychologically survive once removed outside of his own black community. And basically, once he came to Bristol, he drunk himself to death.
Perrault, I am sorry to inform you, died a few months ago after being almost useless, caused by drunkenness and dissipation. Almost ever since we left Nevis in 1794, his conduct has been very reprehensible, insomuch that his mistress and every branch of my family have urged me to discharge him and send him back to Nevis with an annual allowance.
Perrault never made it back to his family in Nevis. The only records of his life are John Pinney's letters.
Okay.
But 200 years later...
So basically what they're saying is, his whole family said, send that black man back down to Africa, let him be alone. And he said, nah, he ain't sending her. He'd rather have him die up there drinking himself to death than send him home to Africa where he belongs. That's a response to all of those people, those clowns who say that, oh, we did the Africans a benefit by kidnapping them from their motherland, by kidnapping them from the interior and the West Coast and the central part of Africa and South Africa and bringing them to America. We did right, but they had a better life. That's a damn lie. Their lives, especially those who lived in the Caribbean and South America, specifically Brazil, was horrible. And here's the thing, even this black man who lived in the comfort up in England with all them gardens and serving that white man for 32 years, even he drunk himself to death. He wanted to go home. There's nothing like going home. All right, there's nothing like having the comforts of your own people and your own language and your own customs, your own traditions and spirituality. And so you didn't do them a favor, even if you think dressing them up in your little European clothes and having them walking around like your pet poodles is benefiting them. No, it didn't. And so let's end that. So all you Africans who say, oh, you are better off now than we are. Hell no. We'd rather be home, and it should have been our choice whether or not we want to leave or not. You all can hop on airplanes. You can hop on Delta and American Airlines. And you can fly from Accra over to New York, and you can go home. We can't go home. We don't even know where our home is. Some of us don't even look like our relatives. We've been passed around, and our mothers and uncles and fathers and whatnot have been sexually assaulted, and men forced to have. We don't even know our home. So don't say you did us a benefit, because that's another defense they try to throw up. Oh, y'all are better off. America's a great country, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, for you, because you had a choice of coming here.
His name is commemorated by a bridge, a symbolic link between Bristol today and its slaving past.
And we reflect on the life of Piero, the man after whom this bridge is named. Piero, a black man, brought to a strange land in circumstances of servitude. So it gives me great pleasure to name this bridge Piero's Bridge, to honor his memory, his name, and the struggle that he represented. Thank you.
By the time of Piero's death, Bristol's gentlemanly traders had been ruthlessly pushed aside. There was a new pretender to the crown of England's leading slave port.
Well, Bristol's heyday in the slave trade, per se, was in the early 18th century, from 1698 till the 1740s, really. And then because she hadn't innovated the port to accommodate the larger ships, because there was a traditionalism about Bristol society, mercantile society, that was not as entrepreneurial, didn't seize the opportunities, as well as newer ports like Liverpool. We find that Liverpool eclipsed her by the mid-18th century and became much more important.
Location had made Bristol the master of the African trade. Location also proved the reason for its downfall. The Avon's retreating tide would regularly leave ships grounded on the mud. But the slave trade was expanding and needed bigger ships. Ambitious captains started to look for ports less awkward than Bristol.
It was a very difficult harbour to develop. And so really, effectively, Bristol was squeezed out of the trade by the bigger, more profitable ships from Liverpool, rather than the rather smaller scale activity that Bristol merchants developed in the 18th century.
Bristol's dominance of the trade with Africa had come to an end. Its merchants had made fortunes and now moved on to other ventures. But their partners in West Africa had no such alternatives. The Africans were trapped in the business of selling people. A ship's captain could buy 100 slaves at a time in the Salaga market, and the demand from the plantations would not let up. African supplies reached further inland. Raiding parties were now spiriting away thousands of slaves.
No, the raiding parties were now spiriting away thousands of captured and kidnapped human beings from the African continent. They were not slaves. They were human beings. That's what they were. They were people. All right. They weren't slaves until they got thrown on them ships and forced to work. Before that, they were human beings. Don't let them use that word, oh, they were slaves, as if they were going inland and getting people's slaves that they had already had, because of some sort of war that happened. That's not what was happening. They were stealing anybody and everybody they could get hold of. They had look. Do you understand what they said in the 1700s or in the 1700s, which is like 1601 to 1699? They had that little port up there called Bristol. But they had so much of a demand for captured Africans to come to the New World. They had to get bigger ports and bigger ships, so they had to move the whole location to Liverpool so they can get bigger ships. They had to fill those ships up. So what did that mean? Those Africans on the West Coast who kidnapped us, that means they had to go further inland to capture Africans. All of them were not victims of war. All of them were not people who owed debts. At this point, I would say the vast majority of them were anybody they could get hold of and catch and lock and shackle up and take to the slave ports, of which there were at least 63, is what I'm saying. In Ghana alone, by the way.
People intentionally raided and kidnapped people into slavery. It was not like that before the Atlantic slave trade was introduced.
People intentionally kidnapped, intentionally raided and kidnapped people. This is what this African scholar said. It was not like that before. When she said people, she means African people intentionally kidnapped, intentionally raided and kidnapped other African people. These weren't wars now. They were just running up in there stealing anybody they could get hold of. This is what this African scholar at the University of Ghana is telling you. This is what this woman is telling you here. You don't believe me? That's fine. I wouldn't believe me either, but I'm going to believe this expert. This expert is who I would rely on in court to testify as to the facts. And this is what she's saying is happening. Period. So stop running from this. Let me run this back so y'all can hear this again, because some of y'all are hard-headed. You refuse to believe that fat meat is greasy, as the folks in the South used to say. So let me let y'all hear this again.
People intentionally raided and kidnapped people into slavery. It was not like that before the Atlantic slave trade was introduced, because you had enough for the indigenous system. So why should I kidnap?
The traders hit upon a new strategy. Wars between African nations always meant captives for sale. So the slavers supplied arms to some nations and encouraged their kings to wage war on vulnerable neighbors.
Now you see how slick that is? They will tell you in history, oh, the only people that end up being slaves were the losers of the war. But they never tell you, oh, we just gonna manufacture some more so we can have a reason to run up in here and steal people and take them overseas. That's what's said now. We just gonna manufacture what it's just like, you know what, we gonna make some stuff illegal so we can have a reason to lock you up. Doesn't that sound familiar? Jim Crow? Yeah, you loiter, you stand out here for more than 15 minutes, you loiter, and I'm gonna give you 20 years in jail. And while you're in there, we're gonna have you do some slave labor. We're gonna have you do the same labor that your people just got emancipated from, and we fought a war for, the convict leasing program. This is what we're gonna do. So it's slick, family. Don't believe that foolishness. Our African, look, the Europeans will look, we're gonna give y'all 50 guns, and y'all go over there. Now that's not enough to do any damage to any of their ships. That's not enough to fight against them, but it is enough for you to go over and take over a tribe, a group of people who may be, 300-400 deep, capture all them and bring us to here. Bring them to us. You just got enough. You got enough to do damage to yourself. You're only dangerous to yourself, not us. That's how they would halfway arm them. And the Africans went right along with it. Listen to it again.
People intentionally raided and kidnapped people into slavery. It was not like that before the Atlantic slave trade was introduced, because you had enough for the indigenous system, so why should I kidnap?
The traders hit upon a new strategy. Wars between African nations always meant captives for sale. So the slavers supplied arms to some nations and encouraged their kings to wage war on vulnerable neighbors.
When there was peace, it means there were no captives to be sold as slaves. And therefore, the slave trade would tend to decline at that particular moment. And then when there were wars, then of course the captives would be brought, and then the slave trade would be flourishing. So in a way, or to a large extent, the slave trade depended, I think, heavily on the conflicts between the local African people.
Did you hear that? Did you hear that? Y'all didn't hear that. Basically what he said was, when there was no conflicts, the slave trade would diminish. It would decrease. So they had to go out there and manufacture conflicts so that they could have more slaves. So when they tell you that, oh, these Africans were mostly just victims of war, they were just POWs of war, and that was something that was traditionally going on in Africa for thousands of years, that's a damn lie. That's a lie the Europeans made up, and the Africans went in and enforced it. They all went in cahoots together. We just gonna make up some more so we can have some more POWs so we can sell them as slaves. This is the big lie. And most of you black folks black Americans don't bother scratching past the surface so you can see it for what it is. Just a big damn lie, just a big excuse to exploit something. And despite what my man here is saying here, let me see, I want to go to this content. Charles Irby said there was already a market. The white man just expanding the market. No, that's like comparing a dog to a werewolf. It wasn't like that. Okay, yeah, we won a war. We got some slaves. War's over. These people, you know what? We keep them around. They might marry into the family, have somebody's baby. Next thing, they part of the tribe. That was like servitude for a little while. They didn't have a place for jail. This is different. This ain't what we were sold into. And the Africans knew it. Our African brothers knew exactly what they were doing. It's a big difference.
Slave traders had started an arms race in Africa. They never gave any African nation enough weaponry to challenge European power, but the guns served to keep Africans fighting each other for a century. The years of conflict and depopulation left a legacy from which Africa has still not recovered.
So imagine,
many people are saying, why talk about the slave trade? We want to forget about it. It was such a terrible crime against humanity. Millions of people were sent. Again, we can't tell the number. We could talk about the number game in history. Some say 10 million, some say 12, some say 20 million. Some even say 300 million Africans were sent away. And Africa was depopulated. And all these things happened. We are putting up with it right now.
So I want you to understand what she just said. By taking Africans from Africa, right? You're taking the people away. You're taking the leaders. You're taking the engineers. You're taking its most valuable resources, human being. How can you build anything if every time you look up, you got somebody raiding your little town or raiding your little village, taking half your people away, taking your leader, your mayor, your policeman, the people, the farmers, all the people. You can never build anything. And Africa is still recovering from that. It's your people that makes your nation. And so Africa itself never recovered. Why? Because its own kings and leaders and rulers sold its people away for money to its own disservice. This is what they did. This is the atrocity that slavery was.
Slave trade left an indelible mark on this part of Africa.
When I compare it with the Nazis, I think the world perhaps has not given sufficient attention to the fact that Africans had suffered a Holocaust before the Jews did.
What it does to me is just a sense of outrage, of just limitless anger. I think that our underdevelopment can be traced to this period because by 1400, people who have also used iron and domesticated animals and started cereal development, rice and corn and such things.
This black man, this black professor is basically saying that we were online and past the Europeans. We were there already in the 14th century. And so, but because of the theft and the decimation of our people and the taking of our people, we were set back hundreds of years. This is what this man is saying. Okay, he's saying the theft and the enslavement and the theft of Africans and taking them to the New World, it set us back. That's what this black professor is saying.
We had no time to advance upon these. If you use the words of the most revered explorer, David Livingstone, commerce, civilization, and Christianity, the 3 C's. The first one we understand, trade. The slave trade itself was a commercial enterprise. I mean, the very forts that you will see on our coastline were not holiday resorts. They were holding pens for human beings. Then you talk of civilization. What kind of civilization were you talking about? Africa had civilizations. But because of the transatlantic slave trade, that civilization almost came to an abrupt end.
Africa was destined for a future of poverty and conflict. England's royal venture had reinvented the trade in human beings. And Caribbean planters were refining a brutal new system, plantation slavery.
All right. I appreciate you guys hanging in there. I think this has been a very interesting conversation. I'm happy we're having this conversation. It's an unfortunate conversation. It's a very uncomfortable conversation because it requires us to dispel some of these notions that we have about our brothers. But the truth is, family, we've been selling each other out for money for thousands of years, you know, and it doesn't take that much to get us divided. But for the purposes of reparations, which is a conversation that Black folks have been throwing around in the air for the past, 4, 5, 6, 7 decades, we need to figure out who actually is at fault. And so when you begin from the beginning of the crime, when you begin from the beginning of the tort, the loss, you want to see who are all the players. And the first players involved are our own African brothers and sisters, and the kings and the lords and the governments involved at the time. And they worked with the European governments. And they kidnapped us and they sold us and they filled those demands and they brought us over here to what is called the New World. And so this is something that we have to deal with. We can't run from it. If we do, we're just cowards. And we just might as well kick this down the road for a generation of African Americans that are far braver than us. If you're going to be cowards about it, go ahead and be a coward. Turn your YouTube off. You don't have to see this, period. But before I want to make sure I acknowledge the place. The video that I showed you guys is called "When the Slave Traders Were African Kings: Britain's Slave Trade timeline, and it was it's Timeline World History Documentaries, and so you can check that out. I'm going to put the link in the chat room. I definitely want you all to check that out. I think it's high time that we made this part of our history. Clearly, they're not going to teach this in Black American history, and your Black American and the typical Black American African study, they're not going to teach it either. They don't want you, because this messes up what they're trying to do. They're trying to make the white man to be the bad guy so they can get all the Black people behind them so they can keep getting you to give them funding. They can't say, well, it was this one, it was that. Y'all are, that's too confusing. They need to say, that's the enemy over there. That's the bad guy. All y'all get behind me and I'm going to talk bad to the bad guy over there. They can't tell you, well, it was the Africans had this part and the Europeans had this part, and then we had some Black Americans over here doing the same damn thing that the white folks were doing over here. They don't want you to do that. That's confusing. You need to have one desert. They feel you're too simple of a people to have too many bad guys to point to. You need one bad guy, and then you get behind them. Because see, at some point, some of y'all are going to say something like, well, hell, there's a conflict of interest in this. You see? Some of y'all are going to say, well, damn, I plan to move to Ghana. I plan to move to Nigeria or something like that. And I don't want them to get sued and have to give up $1 trillion to African Americans. I don't want Nigeria to have to do that. You see? And so they're not ever going to speak the truth to you like this. But as a litigator, as a person who's simply looking at this as an exercise in prosecuting a case in a civil matter, I want to look at all the parties who are indispensable. And you cannot look at the purchaser without looking at the seller. That's like saying you mad at the drug user, but you're not mad at the goddamn drug seller. That makes no sense. You got to get both of them for their part. You heard what these people said. You heard what these Black professors from the motherland said. Not one of them was an American descendant of slaves. So this is for you African brothers and sisters who are looking. These are all scholars from Ghana and the motherland saying this. These are all Ghanaian scholars, professors, doctors saying that it was Ghana and its people and those lords and those kings, those tribal kings. It was them that played a part in this. Everybody was getting it. They would make up reasons to go run up in your tribe and your village. Everybody was getting it. Now we're going to continue this. I got some other ones that I want to bring, other videos we're going to talk about. I think this is important. It's not something we can handle. If you appreciate this conversation, then go ahead and contribute to the Super Chat, the Cash App, and the PayPal. I plan on having several lawyers come onto my page, and we're going to discuss the idea of reparations from a legal standpoint. Now, we're going to talk generally, just some basic venue. We're going to talk about parties. We're going to talk about standing. We're going to talk about how we figure out who is and who would be responsible. We're just going to have a general exercise. You see, but everybody was getting it. You had people, there were people who, the king of the tribe, son got kidnapped and brought to the New World and was made a slave until they found out, oh yeah, he parted, let him go. Period. It didn't matter what religion you were, everybody could get it. They wiped out whole regions of the country. Everybody, period. There was no, it didn't matter. They didn't care about your religion. They didn't care who you were. They were coming to get you. Yeah, they started off, they had some structure, but after about year 329 out of 350, more or less, everybody was getting kidnapped and drugged into those ships, period. Millions and millions of people, millions. Some say 12 million. You heard the scholar, she said maybe 300 million were kidnapped and brought to the New World. That's everybody. So either way, I appreciate this, you guys. If you appreciate what I'm doing, make sure you contribute to the Super Chat, the Cash App, and the PayPal. Look for the next one like this, where we're going to continue this conversation. I invite anybody to come on. Tell me, did I miss something here? Because all I see is potential parties to be sued for reparations. Now, if you have a problem with that, if you don't think that, oh, well, we shouldn't sue them, Well, then who we gonna get that part of the money that they owe us from? Everybody's got to pay. If we really going for it, we serious about it. The European governments, the African governments, the European royalty, the crowns, the African crowns, everybody needs to pay us for what they owe us. We got millions of descendants of from the African continent between North America, South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, and they owe us. And they got rich from us. They owe us, and we need to get paid for it. Look, you can love who you want to love, family. I know you love your African brothers. Go on back there for the no return. Go visit the slave castle. Do all that. But that doesn't stop the fact that they owe you some money. Just like if your homeboy borrowed $20 from you and didn't pay you back, you still love him, but I want my money, right? There's nothing wrong with you wanting your money. Get your money. This is the justice that we can get. You can't put them in slavery like they had us in slavery for hundreds of years, but they can pay you. That's the least they can do, right? Make you whole again, make you the people that you would have been had they left you alone. That's what I want. So think about that. Either way, this is Uncle D. I love you guys. And as I always said this time, on this very serious subject, I'm just going to say, God bless you all. I love you.